The strangest part wasn't waking up with my client's head on my shoulder at 30,000 feet. The strangest part was that I didn't move. I'd known Renata, sorry, Ms. Beaumont Clark, for 11 months before that flight. 11 months of polished conference calls, carefully worded emails, and the kind of professional distance you maintain when someone's company is responsible for 40% of your annual contract value. She ran a mid-sized architectural firm out of Calgary, one of those places that felt simultaneously like a design museum and a functioning office. Glass everywhere. Plants that looked too healthy to be real. Staff who walked quietly, like they'd been trained for it. I was the freelance project coordinator she'd hired to manage the rollout of their new project management software. Third party, neutral, disposable. The kind of role you hire out specifically so that when things go wrong, there's someone who isn't on payroll to absorb the blame. I was good at it. I kept my opinions to myself, I hit my deadlines, and I never once let Renata know that I found her genuinely, distractingly difficult to read. She wasn't cold exactly. She was precise. There's a difference, though it took me a while to figure out which one it was. The flight was out of YYC to Toronto for a 2-day vendor conference. Her lead project manager had come down with something the night before. Strep, I think. And Renata had called me at 7 in the morning to ask, in the tone of someone who has already decided the answer, whether I would be available to join her instead. I said yes before I'd finished processing the question. I wasn't sure if that was professionalism or something else. We didn't talk much in the terminal. She was working, thumbing through something on her tablet with the focused quiet of a person who has optimized every available minute. I bought a coffee I didn't need and pretended to read an article I'd already read twice. The gate was crowded. Our flight was delayed 40 minutes because of weather rolling in off the Rockies, that particular kind of February afternoon where the sky turns the color of old concrete and everyone in Alberta instinctively recalibrates their expectations. When we finally boarded and found our seats, side by side in the second row of business class, a detail I'd only noticed when I checked in that morning, Renata tucked her bag under the seat, accepted a sparkling water from the flight attendant, and opened her tablet again without ceremony. "You don't have to sit in silence on my account," she said, without looking up. "I wasn't planning to," I said. She glanced sideways at me then, just briefly. Good. That was it for the first hour. The plane pushed through the cloud cover and leveled out somewhere over Saskatchewan, and the light through the window went flat and gray-white, and I actually did fall asleep for a bit, which I hadn't intended. When I woke up, Renata had closed her tablet. She was looking out the window at nothing in particular, and there was something in her posture that was different, something slightly released, like a held breath let go. She had her shoes off. I noticed that. It's a small thing, but it stuck. "Can I ask you something?" she said, still looking at the window. "Sure. Do you actually like doing this work? The coordination stuff, the rollouts?" She finally turned to look at me. Not as a career pitch, genuinely. I thought about it for a second. Some of it. I like the problem solving. I don't love the part where I'm managing up to people who've already made up their minds. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Is that a comment on this project?" "It's a comment on every project." She was quiet for a moment. Then, fair. We talked for the rest of the flight. Not about the software rollout. Not about her firm. Not about anything that would have fit into a meeting agenda. She told me she'd started her career as an actual architect, had spent 6 years doing residential work in Vancouver before her business partner convinced her to pivot toward management. She missed drawing, she said, not the drafting software, the actual drawing, pencil on paper, and she kept a sketchbook in her bag that she hadn't opened in 4 months. I told her I'd gone to school for urban planning, had done 2 years in a municipal job in Edmonton that had slowly flattened every creative instinct I'd had, and had gone freelance partly out of desperation and partly because I was constitutionally unsuited to sitting in the same chair every day. "So we're both in the wrong job," she said. "I think we're both in the adjacent job," I said. She considered this. That might be worse. The plane started its descent into Pearson. Right around then, the CN Tower emerging through the cloud cover, like something from a picture someone's Canadian grandmother has framed in her hallway. And Renata had gone back to being composed and organized, and exactly the person I'd spent 11 months being professionally careful around. The conference hotel was the kind of place that had a name with grand in it and justified it with a lobby full of marble and indirect lighting. We checked in separately. Our rooms were on different floors. I told myself this was relevant information and then told myself to stop. The first day was straightforward. Presentations, breakout sessions, the particular social obligation of conference networking, which I find mildly exhausting and have never admitted this to anyone who's hired me. Renata moved through it like she'd done it 100 times, which she probably had. She introduced me to people with the easy confidence of someone who never forgets a name. And I did my job, and we ate dinner at a restaurant the conference had booked. Big table, 12 people, one of those meals where the conversation never quite lands anywhere interesting. She texted me at 10:15 that night. Still awake? I looked at the message for a second. Yeah. There's a bar in the hotel that has decent wine and bad jazz. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes wondering if it's strange to ask a contractor to get a drink. I typed back, "It's only strange if the wine is bad." It's not. The bar was underground, accessible through a corridor, felt like it belonged to a different decade of the hotel's history. All dark wood and low ceilings, and a piano player, who was, in fact, playing badly, though with evident enthusiasm. Renata was at a corner table with a glass of red already half finished and her blazer over the back of the chair. She looked like a different person than the one who'd been at the conference table 6 hours earlier. Not unprofessional, she never quite lost that quality, but looser, somehow. Like she'd remembered she was a person who existed outside of meetings. "I never do this," she said when I sat down. "Get a drink. Invite someone I work with to get a drink. I'm usually the one who goes to bed at a reasonable hour and feels quietly superior about it in the morning. And tonight, I felt like company." She said it simply, without apology, and I liked that. I liked it more than I thought I should. We talked about the conference, and then about Calgary, and then about a project she'd worked on 8 years ago in Banff that she still considered the best thing she'd done professionally. A small community arts center, nothing significant by industry standards, but designed from the ground up in close conversation with the people who would use it. She pulled out her phone and showed me photographs. The building was beautiful. The kind of building that looked like it had been listening. She ordered a second glass of wine, and then a third, and I was keeping pace more or less. And the jazz was getting worse and funnier as the evening went on, and at some point, she said something that made me laugh hard enough that the couple at the next table looked over, and for a while, we were just two people in a hotel bar in Toronto, enjoying each other's company in an uncomplicated way. Except that it wasn't entirely uncomplicated. I was aware of that, even in the middle of it. She was still the person who controlled the contract that made up a significant portion of my income. I was still the contractor. There were lines that existed for good reasons. But the evening had its own momentum, and I was finding it increasingly hard to remember what exactly I'd meant to be careful about. By the time the piano player finally packed up and the bar started to thin out, it was close to 1 in the morning. Renata was fine, not drunk exactly, but softened, her usual precision, slightly blurred at the edges. She stood and reached for her blazer and nearly caught the edge of the table. "Okay," she said, with the particular dignity of someone recalibrating. "I'm going to pretend that didn't happen." "Pretend what didn't happen?" "Good man." We took the elevator up. Her floor came first. The doors opened and she stepped out and turned around, and she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely parse. Something thoughtful, slightly uncertain, like she was weighing a question she hadn't finished forming yet. "This was good," she said. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not making it weird." The doors closed. I stood in the elevator and thought about that for the 3 floors up to my room. For not making it weird. I wasn't entirely sure if that was a compliment or a mild disappointment. I didn't sleep well. Not for any dramatic reason. The hotel bed was perfectly fine. The room was quiet. I just kept replaying the evening in pieces. The photograph of the arts center. The way she'd laughed. The moment at the elevator. I told myself this was normal, that I was reading too much into what had been, objectively, a pleasant but professionally bounded evening between two people who worked together. I told myself this several times. The second conference day started at 8:30. I got to the breakfast room at 8, and Renata was already there, coffee in hand, reading something on her phone, fully composed in a way that suggested either she'd slept fine or she'd had considerably more practice at compartmentalization than I had. She looked up when I came in. Morning, morning. There's a good session on integrated project timelines at 10. You should come. That was it. Back to normal. I poured myself a coffee and sat down and told myself this was probably for the best. The session on integrated timelines was in fact pretty good. We sat next to each other, and she made notes in the margins of the printed handout with the focused energy of someone who actually intends to implement things, and at one point, she leaned over and pointed to something on my copy and said, "This is the part your predecessor always got wrong." Quietly enough that only I could hear, and I could smell her perfume, which was subtle and probably expensive. And I had to concentrate fairly hard on the slide that was being presented. Lunch was a conference buffet. We sat at different tables. This was coincidence and also, I suspected, a mutual tacit agreement that we were both better off with some structural distance for a few hours. The afternoon sessions ran long. By 4 o'clock, I was in that particular state of conference fatigue where you're still absorbing information, but your body has quietly begun negotiating for an exit. Renata found me in the hallway afterward and said the firm's original return flight had been bumped. The booking had been reshuffled by the airline, something about equipment issues, and did I have any particular commitment on the other side? I didn't. My return had been flexible. I've rebooked us on the 7:15, she said. That gives us a few hours. I'd rather not spend them in the terminal. We walked down to the waterfront. It was cold, proper Toronto cold, that wet Lake Ontario cold that doesn't have the dramatic dryness of an Alberta winter but gets into your coat anyway, and the light was going down orange over the water in a way that was genuinely nice. We stopped at a coffee place on Queen's Quay and sat by the window and watched the last of the afternoon joggers and dog walkers, and I realized I'd been spending the entire day in a state of low-grade careful attention to everything she did, which was not a sustainable situation. "Can I say something?" I said, that I'd normally probably not say. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Probably. I'm having a genuinely hard time figuring out what yesterday evening was." She was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, she did that thing she did, where silence was just a space she was willing to use. "What do you mean? What it was?" "I mean whether it was just two colleagues unwinding after a conference day. Or something else. And I'm aware that the power dynamic here makes this question awkward to even ask." "The power dynamic," she repeated. "You're the client, I'm the contractor. There's a version of this where asking the question is itself a problem." She looked at me directly. "Or there's a version where not asking it is more of a problem." I waited. "Last night," she said slowly, "was the most genuinely enjoyable evening I've spent with someone in probably 8 months, including non-work evenings, which tells me something about the state of my social life, but also possibly about something else." She paused. "The contract runs through June. What you do with that information is your business." I thought about this. If the contract weren't a factor, she said, I would have stayed in that elevator. The coffee place was quiet around us. Outside, a streetcar went by on the tracks that ran along the waterfront, its windows lit up orange against the early dark. I didn't say anything right away. I'm not sure what I would have said. "But it is a factor," she said, not with resignation exactly, more with the tone of someone who takes the actual shape of the world seriously and has decided to say so. "So I think what I'm suggesting is that we're both adults who are capable of finishing the contract professionally and then figuring out what, if anything, comes after." 4 months, I said. 4 months. That's a long time to know what I know now. She looked out the window for a second. "Yes," she said, "it is. We made it to the airport with time to spare. The flight home was shorter somehow, or felt shorter, conversation easier than it had any right to be given, what we'd both just acknowledged. She fell asleep about 40 minutes in, her head tipping against my shoulder at some point past midnight, somewhere over the shield, and I didn't move, and I didn't sleep, and I thought about 4 months and what it meant to know something without being able to do anything with it yet. I thought about the building in Banff, the one she designed in close conversation with the people who would use it. How the good buildings, she'd said, were the ones where you listened first. I left her to sleep until we were on final approach into Calgary, and then I said her name quietly, and she was awake and composed within seconds, that particular skill some people have, and she straightened and looked out the window at the city lights spreading out below in the cold February dark. "Good landing?" she said. "Good flight," I said. She nodded, just slightly, like that was the right answer. The contract ended on June 14th. I sent a close-out summary and a final invoice and a note that said, in the professional language of project completion, that it had been a pleasure and that I hoped the platform served them well. She replied within an hour. The email was 3 lines of acknowledgement and 1 line at the end that said, "Also, if you're free Saturday, there's a gallery opening in Inglewood I've been meaning to see." No agenda. I read that last part twice. No agenda. I replied, "I'm free Saturday. We met at the gallery at 7. She was already inside when I got there, standing in front of a large painting. Abstract, a lot of blue, the kind of thing that makes you feel something before you can explain what. And she turned when she heard me come in and smiled. A real one, the kind that doesn't have any professional calibration in it at all. "You came," she said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" I wasn't completely sure. I stood next to her and looked at the painting. "It's good," I said. "It is," she agreed. We stayed for 2 hours. We had wine from plastic cups, the particular indignity of gallery openings. We argued gently about one piece near the back that I liked and she found overwrought. She was right, probably. I didn't concede it immediately because I was enjoying the argument. Outside afterward, on the sidewalk, it was one of those June evenings that feel like a gift. Warm and long-lit, and easy in a way that February had no capacity for. She had her hands in her jacket pockets, and we were walking without a particular destination. "I keep the sketchbook in my bag," she said at some point. "I opened it last month for the first time in a while. What did you draw?" She glanced over. Something I'd been thinking about for a while. I didn't ask what. There are questions that don't need to be completed. We walked down along the river pathway as the sky went from orange to blue to the particular dark that holds on to light longer than it should in a prairie June. And I thought about 11 months of careful professional distance and 2 days in Toronto, and 4 months of knowing something and waiting for it to become available to act on. It had been worth it. The waiting. I don't say that about most things. She stopped on the bridge over Bow River and leaned on the railing and looked at the water moving below us, and I stood beside her, and she said, without looking at me, "I'm glad you didn't make it weird." On the flight. And after, "I'm glad you stayed in the elevator," I said. She turned her head and looked at me with the expression I'd been trying to parse since February. I understood it now. It was a person paying very close attention. "That's not what happened," she said. "I know," I said, "but it's what you meant." She was quiet for a moment then. Very simply, "Yeah, it was." Somewhere up the path, a cyclist went by with a light on their handle bars. Small and white, briefly illuminating the railing and then gone. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Some things earn their own silence.